They didn't explain. They just said, "Please leave your badge on the table." That morning was an entirely ordinary Monday in Soho. No rain, no harsh sunlight, nothing memorable from the outside. I walked into the familiar building, carrying the leather bag I had used for years and holding a cup of still warm coffee. The security guard nodded like always. The elevator rose to the usual floor, stopping with a soft metallic sound. Everything followed the old rhythm, the rhythm I had lived inside for nearly 20 years. The meeting email arrived at 7:13 in the morning. One short line. No subject, no explanation, a brief meeting, a small room. In this industry, meetings like that happen all the time. I had walked into far worse rooms to deal with much more serious problems. Delayed orders, fabric that failed inspection. Factories are short on workers in the middle of peak season. Compared to those, a Monday morning meeting did not worry me. The conference room sat at the end of the hallway. Frosted glass, a light wood table, cold, even lighting overhead. Two people were already there. One from Human Resources, a familiar face that felt distant. The other was someone I had never worked with directly, but I understood his role well enough in the new organizational chart. I sat down, placed my bag beside the chair, and waited for them to begin. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the steady hum of the air conditioning above us. They spoke immediately, without small talk. The tone was carefully prepared, polite enough, detached enough. No opening remarks, no. Thank you for the years that have passed. Just a notification. The company had decided to terminate my employment. Effective immediately, no reason given, no questions asked. The human resources representative gently slid a small tray toward me. On it lay my access badge. The badge I had scanned every day. The badge that had brought me back to the office at 11 at night, when a factory called with a problem. Now it sat there, like an object that had completed its purpose. "Please leave your badge on the table," she said evenly. I looked at the badge for a moment longer than necessary, not because I did not understand what was happening, but because I was holding myself back from reacting on instinct. A very clear flash of anger passed through me, quick and cold. Not the kind that wants to argue or prove a point. The kind you feel when you realize you have just been reduced to a line in a spreadsheet. But I did not ask why. I did not argue. I did not mention how many years I had been there. I did not bring up the times I stood between two tense sides to keep the supply chain from breaking. I simply nodded and placed the badge on the wooden table. Plastic against wood made a dry, quiet sound, small but sharp in the silent room. The overhead lights reflected faintly off the tabletop. No scattered papers, no cups of water, no sign that this was a place where a long chapter had just ended. The human resources representative added a few sentences about procedures, insurance, and personal belongings. I listened, but I did not try to memorize any of it. Those details mattered less than the feeling that everything had already been decided, and that my presence in that room was now only a formality. When I stood up, no one stood with me. I pushed the chair in neatly, out of old habit, picked up my bag, and stepped into the hallway. The frosted glass door closed behind me so softly it made no sound at all. Outside, people were still walking, speaking quietly, continuing an ordinary workday. Life in that building did not slow down just because I had left. On the way to the elevator, I thought about a phrase that had been showing up more and more often in recent meetings. Human optimization. It sounded modern, timely, as if people were variables you could adjust with software. In the technology world, maybe that made sense, but in a hands-on garment industry, where every stitch passes through real hands, the phrase always made me smile tiredly. You cannot optimize a tailor with 30 years of experience by installing a new system. You cannot replace trust between partners with a polished dashboard, but I knew those things did not appear in the reports they were reading. I stepped outside the building. The morning air was cooler than I expected. Soho was loud in its familiar way. Commuters, traffic, cafes opening their doors. The city kept moving, the way it always does. I paused for a moment, looked up at the glass reflecting the building behind me, then turned away. That was when I realized this feeling was not mine alone. Not just in New York. I had heard similar stories from friends in other industries. Someone in Chicago, someone in London, someone in smaller cities where everyone knows each other's names. The feeling of being removed without explanation. The feeling of having a badge, an access right, taken back, as if that were all you ever left behind. If you are listening to this story, I truly want to know where you are listening from. Which city? Which country? Maybe you are in your car, on the way to work. Maybe you are at home, or somewhere far from New York. If you would like, leave a short comment, just to say where you are listening from. Sometimes knowing you are not the only one who has stood in front of a closing door like that is enough to make things feel a little lighter. I walked toward the subway station. My mind was not on why they did it. I did not need that answer. I was thinking about what I was carrying with me, not in the leather bag on my shoulder, but the things they could not take back in that small conference room. I did not argue. I simply carried the one thing they forgot to read. If one factory stops, the entire collection falls behind. I was never a designer. I did not work in marketing. I did not appear at photo shoots or stand beside models under stage lights. My name rarely showed up in internal newsletters and never on clothing labels. My work was not pretty to talk about, and it was not easy to explain in a single sentence. But if you asked what I did, the most honest answer would be this: I kept things from breaking. Supply chains in the garment industry are nothing like people imagine. They are not clean arrows on a presentation slide. They are people, overlapping schedules, and small decisions made under intense time pressure. When one link fails, there is no time for long meetings or careful emails. There were days my work started at 6 in the morning and ended when I could no longer remember when I had eaten dinner. A typical workday rarely looked the same. Some mornings I would get a call saying a fabric shipment from North Carolina was delayed by 2 days because of a factory issue. Those 2 days, if not handled quickly, could throw off the entire cutting schedule. I would call the factory, explain the situation, negotiate, and find a workaround. Not using technical language, but relying on mutual understanding built over the years. On other days, the problem was the stitching. A shipment was rejected because the seams did not meet standards. No one wanted to take responsibility. The fabric supplier said it was not their fault. The factory insisted the workers followed procedure. In those moments, I was the one who had to go there in person, hold the garment in my hands, examine every stitch, and speak directly with the worker who made it. Not to blame anyone, but to find the fastest fix with the least damage. Then there were times when the issue was simpler, but harder to solve. Labor shortages. A few workers are calling in sick at the same time. A new hiring round not yet trained. Those things rarely showed up clearly in reports, but if left unaddressed, the consequences came quickly. I had to rearrange orders, adjust timelines, and sometimes accept producing less in the short term to preserve long-term stability. Through all of this, what I relied on was not authority or title, it was credibility. Credibility was built from never disappearing when there was a problem. I answered my phone. I showed up when needed. I was clear about what could be done and what could not. And most importantly, I kept my word. There was a factory in New Jersey that I thought about often on the morning I left the building in Soho. It was run by an immigrant family. The father had been a tailor since he was very young. He built the factory from 2 old sewing machines and a few relatives. For many years, he was the first person I called whenever there was an urgent order, not because he was the cheapest, but because he did it right. He passed away a few years ago. After the funeral, I went to the factory, not to talk contracts, but to sit quietly with his family for an afternoon. His daughter took over the business. She was capable, but young, and this industry is not kind to new leaders. In those first months, she called me often, sometimes to ask a small question, sometimes just to be sure she was doing the right thing. She did not trust automated system emails. She trusted the voice on the other end of the line. She trusted it because I had been around long enough to understand what could not be written into a process. She trusted it because I never exaggerated and never promised what I was unsure of. I never considered any of that an achievement. I never counted how many times I helped a factory through a crisis. I never used those stories to negotiate a position or a raise. I simply did my work the way I believed was right. Some relationships, once you turn them into numbers, you lose them. Many people think my role could be replaced by a better system. I do not oppose technology. I just know that in the most critical moments, people do not look for a dashboard. They look for someone they trust will pick up the phone. Standing outside the subway station that morning, I thought about those calls. The ones not written into contracts, not listed in job descriptions, yet the ones that kept everything moving. I thought about the small factories and the people who had been tied to this brand longer than the people who had just decided to fire me. I did not know what would happen next, but I knew one thing very clearly. Fashion does not run on trends, it runs on trust. He came from an industry where everything could be replaced. I knew it from the first day he walked into the large conference room on the top floor, not because of how he dressed or how he shook hands, but because of the language he used. He talked about speed, scalability, and reducing friction in the system. Those words were not unfamiliar. I had heard them many times in recent years. They were usually spoken by people who had never stood outside a garment factory at 5 in the morning, trying to solve a problem that did not appear in any report. He was the new chief executive officer, hired from the tech retail sector, a decision the board was very proud of. And to be fair, his track record was real. At his previous company, he had cut operating costs, restructured distribution, and delivered steady revenue growth quarter after quarter. Those numbers were presented beautifully during his first introduction. Upward charts, balanced colors, clear labels. I looked at them and understood why people in the room nodded. I did not deny what he had achieved. In his former industry, those results were genuine success. When you sell online, when warehouses are run by barcodes and algorithms, and when people are just one part of a process, optimization makes sense. Replacing one link with another does not break the system. It only needs to be reconfigured. But this industry does not work that way. In the early meetings, he talked a lot about dashboards, about everything needing to be visible in real time, about how it was risky to rely on any one individual for too long. I sat there, listened, and took notes, the way I always did. I did not challenge him. I did not argue. I simply wondered whether he had ever stood inside a garment factory. Not on a tour, not for photos, but long enough to understand why a production line suddenly slows down and why there is not always an immediate answer. He also spoke about standardization, about factories needing to follow the same processes and standards so they could be managed more easily. It sounded reasonable. But standardization in hands-on garment manufacturing is not the same as standardization in an automated warehouse. Each factory works differently, shaped by the people it has, the experience they carry, and very real constraints. Some things cannot be forced into a mold without breaking. Then he moved on to the cost of people. He did not use the word layoffs, he used streamlining. It sounded lighter, cleaner. In that language, people became a cost line that could be adjusted. I looked around the room. Some nodded, some stayed silent. I did not see anyone ask a question. What unsettled me was not that he wanted change. This industry needs change. I knew that better than anyone. What made me uneasy was the absolute confidence in his voice, the confidence of someone who believes that if one person leaves, another can replace them. If one factory fails to meet metrics, another will step in. If one relationship breaks, another email can be sent. Once, during a meeting on operational efficiency, he pointed to a chart and said that if a partner failed to meet targets, we should consider replacement. His voice was calm, as if he were talking about an internet service provider, not a family-run factory that had worked with this brand for more than 20 years. I looked at the chart. It was clean, clear, but I could not see the people behind those numbers. I began to feel a quiet sense of unease, not because I feared losing my job. I had been in this long enough to know no position is permanent. I worried about other things, about relationships that could not be replaced as quickly as he assumed, about small factories that would not understand what was happening when they suddenly received a cold email instead of a familiar phone call. Some evenings, reviewing schedules, I wondered if he understood what he was actually holding. Not just contracts or revenue, but a fragile network of trust. It does not collapse loudly, it simply withdraws when it is treated like a variable. I did not voice these thoughts. I did not warn anyone. I did not stand up in meetings to object. Not because I did not care, but because I understood something. People who believe in replaceability usually believe in it only until they lose what cannot be bought back with speed or money. His reports remained polished. Meetings stayed on schedule. Slides continued to glide smoothly across the screen. From the outside, everything looked on track. But somewhere underneath, I felt a subtle tension, as a thread pulled too tight. Not broken yet, but with no slack left. When I left the office that morning, I thought back to those meetings, to the confident voice, to the neatly drawn plans, and to the distance between what was being called supply chain management and what I had been doing for years. He thought this was supply chain management. I knew it was trust management. Some clauses only take effect when it is already too late. I thought about that many times during my years working here, usually in very quiet moments. Not when signing a major contract, and not during strategy meetings filled with leadership. I thought about it when I was alone with thick folders, after everyone else had gone home, rereading lines few people cared about once the ink had dried. In the garment industry, supplier contracts are usually simple: price, quantity, and delivery dates. People call them vendor contracts, sign them, and file them away. But after years of handling problems no clause had ever anticipated, I began to see that approach as insufficient. Not enough to protect the supply chain during disruption, and not enough to protect the relationships the company relied on every day. So I proposed a different kind of agreement: vendor continuity agreements. Not an attractive name, nothing you would highlight in a board presentation. But the idea was straightforward. It was not just about transactions, it was about continuity. That if there were changes in personnel or structure, the supply chain could not simply be severed by an administrative decision. When I first raised the idea, legal was not enthusiastic. They said it made contracts more complex than necessary. The company should not place itself in a position of depending on one individual. I understood those concerns. No company likes being bound to a person. But I also understood what internal memos never say out loud. In practice, the company was already dependent. It just had never been written down. The supply chain operating framework I used was not the product of a brainstorming session or an internal training course. It was built gradually, year by year, through direct work with factories, suppliers, and operations teams. It was how I connected people to schedules, resolved friction before it became a crisis, and kept things moving even when something went wrong. When I presented that framework to the company, I did not ask for recognition or absolute ownership. I asked only for an accurate acknowledgement of what it was. So in the related agreements, there was a very specific clause. The supply chain operating framework I developed was licensed on an annual basis. Licensed, not transferred. Each year, the company had the right to use that framework within agreed limits. When the term ended, that right had to be renewed. This was not about leverage or obstruction. It simply reflected the reality that the framework did not originate inside the company, and it did not exist separately from the person who built it. Another detail, often skimmed over, was that my name appeared explicitly in the relevant appendices, not as a job title that could change, but as an individual: Claire Whitman. The person responsible for continuity in supplier relationships was named in the contract. When I asked for this, someone questioned whether it was necessary. I said it was, because I had seen it too many times, how a role could be replaced on paper while everything in reality still revolved around the same person. Those clauses were not finalized in a single draft. Some years, I spent months refining individual sentences. Some evenings, I sat with lawyers, reading the same paragraph over and over to make sure it said exactly what it needed to say. No more, no less. I was not trying to create a trap. I was drawing a clear boundary between contribution and erasure when someone became inconvenient. There was a meeting, many years ago, that I still remember. A senior leader said plainly that the company could not depend on one individual forever. I did not disagree. I only said that if the company was depending on someone, it should understand exactly what it was depending on and acknowledge it honestly. We compromised. The company gained broader use of the framework. I was assured that the usage was conditional, time-bound, and tied to personal responsibility. Those agreements were signed, stored, and gradually became part of the paperwork that few people revisited after signing. Each year, when renewal came up, I received a very short email from legal. Renew as before. I signed. They signed. No one asked questions. Everything ran smoothly enough that people forgot why those clauses existed. When the new chief executive officer arrived, no one brought these agreements up again. They did not appear in introductions or strategic decks. I did not raise them either. Not because I was hiding anything, but because I understood those clauses only mattered in the right context. And at that time, the context had not yet arrived. Many people do not read contracts closely after signing, not because they are careless, but because they trust precedent. They assume that if something has worked smoothly for years, it will continue. But contracts do not care about human comfort. They care only about what has been written. When I left the meeting room that morning, I did not carry any copies with me. I did not need to. I knew exactly what was in them. I had lived with those words long enough to understand they were not weapons and not a contingency plan for confrontation. They were simply how I ensured that the work I had done and the relationships I had built could not be erased by a single clean decision. I did not write those clauses to defeat anyone. I wrote them in the years when I was still inside the system, still working with people, still believing that things should be handled fairly, even when change came. I wrote them so I would not be erased. No one got angry. That was what made it more frightening. After I left, there were no protest emails, no sharp phone calls, no one raising their voice and insisting this would be clarified. No doors slammed. No one said it was wrong. Everything stayed very quiet. So quiet that if you were not paying close attention, you might think nothing had happened. But in a supply chain, silence is rarely a good sign. The first changes did not come from headquarters. They came from places that rarely appear in presentations. A garment factory in New Jersey sent an email saying they would temporarily pause taking new orders until there was clearer guidance on a point of contact. The email was polite and professional, without any emotion. Just a short notice sent at the end of the workday. The next day, a fabric supplier in Pennsylvania called the purchasing team to ask about payment schedules and to confirm orders for the next quarter, not to complain, just to ask. When they did not receive a convincing answer, they said they would need more time before committing to delivery timelines as before. More time in this industry is rarely good news. None of them said they no longer wanted to work together. They only said they needed to wait. Wait to see who was responsible. Wait to see which direction new decisions would take. Wait to see whether old commitments still hold any weight. Peak season was approaching fast. In garment manufacturing, that requires little explanation. Production schedules are locked early. Every day of delay at the start of the chain creates multiple days of delay at the end. Collections do not wait. Customers do not either. I had lived with that rhythm for years, and I knew this was the moment when a supply chain needed stability most, not sudden change. From the outside, everything still appeared to be functioning. Meetings were still scheduled, reports were still sent, dashboards still showed familiar numbers, at least in the short term, but numbers always lag behind reality. They reflect what has already happened, not what is about to come. During those days, I received a few short messages from people I used to work with, not to check on me. They asked about work, about whether I knew who was handling this area now, about who they should contact when issues come up. I answered briefly. I was no longer there. I was no longer the decision maker, and I said nothing more. On the company side, it took time for them to realize what was happening. Not immediately. There was no single major incident to point to and call a problem, just small delays, a shipment arriving later than expected, a fabric order not yet confirmed, a factory is asking to adjust its monthly capacity. Taken individually, none of those were alarming. In this industry, they happen all the time, but when they began appearing together across different points, they formed a pattern I had learned to recognize early in my career. When relationships begin to pull back, not through words, but through behavior. No one called it a crisis. Not yet. Internal meetings used very soft language. Adjustments, temporary measures, reassessment. No one spoke about root causes. Everyone focused on fixing each small issue, hoping things would rebalance on their own. But supply chains do not rebalance themselves when trust is disrupted. They slow down, and then they stop. I knew this because I had been on the other side. I had been the one receiving the first calls before things became obvious. I had explained to leadership that the problem was not pricing or process, but the fact that partners were no longer certain about who they were working with. And once that certainty is gone, no email can replace it overnight. Days passed, and the silence continued to spread. There were no official notices from factories ending cooperation, no documents stating withdrawal. They simply stopped taking on more work. They stopped signing new commitments. They kept everything at a minimum, enough not to break entirely, but not enough to move forward. That is how long-standing relationships end when they are no longer cared for properly, not with an argument, but with deliberate silence. A pause stretched long enough to make the other side wonder what had changed. Somewhere in executive meetings, someone must have started feeling uneasy. Not because anyone challenged them, but because plans began slipping off course. Forecast numbers had to be revised. Customer commitments need reevaluation. But it was hard to point to a single reason. There was no one to blame, no single mistaken email, just a chain of small decisions leading to the same outcome. I was not in those meetings. I only knew what I knew because I understood how this system reacts when a familiar link disappears. It does not collapse immediately. It tries to adapt. It tries to protect itself. And in doing so, it reduces risk by slowing down. No one stood up and declared they would no longer cooperate, but new signatures began to vanish. Commitments were delayed. Familiar nods no longer appeared. They did not object. They simply stopped signing. The chief executive officer called me, very confident. The call came late in the afternoon when I was sitting at the dining table with a cup of tea that had already gone cold. I recognized the company number immediately. No caller name, just the familiar sequence of digits that had appeared on my phone for years. I let it ring one extra beat before answering. Not because I needed time to think, but because I wanted to hear the silence on the other end more clearly. His voice came through as soon as I said hello. No small talk, no pleasantries. It was firm, slightly urgent, but still carried the confidence of someone who believed he had the upper hand. He said the company was experiencing some unexpected disruptions in the supply chain. Those recent adjustments might have caused misunderstandings, and that it was time for us to have a serious conversation. I listened without interrupting. He spoke at length using familiar boardroom language: responsibility, obligation, operational continuity. Then he mentioned the contract. He did not cite any specific clause. He spoke in general terms, saying that under the contract, I still had certain obligations to the company. His tone was resolute, as if those lines of text stood firmly on his side, as if they were already prepared to pull me back into the path they wanted. I did not respond right away. I let him finish. There was something very familiar in the way he chose his words. It was not a direct threat, but an assumption. The assumption that I would understand the message, that I would recognize my place, that I would remember the contract as a constraint, not as a document with two sides. When he paused, I replied briefly. I said I was open to a conversation, not over the phone. I said that if the company wanted to discuss the contract, it should be a formal meeting, and that I wanted my lawyer present. There was a short silence on the other end. Not long, but long enough for me to notice something had shifted. He asked me to repeat myself, as if to make sure he had heard correctly. A lawyer. I confirmed. No explanation. None was needed. He agreed rather quickly, quicker than I expected, perhaps because he believed the presence of a lawyer would not change the outcome. Perhaps because, in his mind, the contract was already clear. I heard the confidence return to his voice when he said the company's legal team would also attend, that it would be a direct and transparent discussion. The call ended cleanly, no extended goodbye, no apology. I set the phone down on the table and sat still for a moment, not to brace myself, but to register what I was feeling. There was no satisfaction, no tension, just clarity. What was happening was something I had anticipated, even if I had not wanted it to unfold this way. That same evening, I received the meeting invitation, a calendar request sent by the Chief Executive Officer's executive assistant, a short, emotionless subject line: time, location, list of attendees, the Chief Executive Officer, Head of Human Resources, in-house counsel, no one from operations. That told me more than anything written in the email. I accepted the invitation, no added notes, no questions. I forwarded the meeting details to my lawyer, someone who had worked with me for many years but rarely needed to appear. He replied quickly, just one sentence, I will be there. In the days leading up to the meeting, I received no further calls from the company. No one asked what I was thinking. No one tried to persuade or soften the situation. Perhaps they believed everything was already on the table. That is when, faced with the contract, I would understand my position. That the signed pages would be enough to close the matter. I did not reread the contract during those days, not because I did not need to, but because I had lived with it for too long. I knew it was not a stick to strike anyone with. But I also knew it was not harmless paper. It was the result of many years of work, many years of negotiation, and many years of trying to draw boundaries that once seemed unnecessary. I thought about the way he spoke of obligation, the way he emphasized the word, as if obligation only ran in one direction. I wondered how many times he had actually read that contract, or whether he only knew of its existence as a concept, a general layer of protection every company assumes it has. I did not have an answer, and I did not need one yet. The night before the meeting, I prepared very little. Not because I underestimated it, but because I understood its nature. I chose my clothes the same way I always did before difficult conversations. Simple, neutral, unremarkable. I printed a few necessary documents and placed them in a thin folder, not thick, not performative. I did not need to bring much. I only needed to bring the right things. The next morning, as I stepped out of my home, I felt an unusual calm. Not the calm of someone who has won, but of someone who knows exactly where they stand. The meeting ahead was not a place for emotional arguments. It was where assumptions would be placed on the table, and where written words would begin speaking for what people did not want to say. The chief executive officer had called me with the confidence of someone who believed the contract was on their side. He thought that simply invoking it would be enough to pull everything back into the order he expected. He believed the contract was their weapon. I did not argue. I asked to read. The conference room in Soho was the same room, with glass walls looking out onto the busy street, but that morning, no one paid attention to what was outside. The ceiling lights were evenly bright. The long wooden table had been cleaned more thoroughly than necessary, and the chairs aligned neatly as if surface order could compensate for internal disorder. I arrived a few minutes early, not out of anxiety, but because I did not want to walk into a conversation that had already started without me. The chief executive officer was already there. Human Resources sat beside him, hands resting on a thin stack of papers. In-house counsel sat across from me, laptop open but screen still dark. No one smiled, no one rushed. Everything had the air of a meeting where everyone believed the outcome was already decided. After a few polite opening remarks, the chief executive officer moved quickly to the point. He spoke about recent disruptions in the supply chain. He said the company was under significant pressure with peak season approaching. He said my departure had created unwanted gaps. I listened, as I always had. No objection, no nodding. Then he returned to the contract. He said that under the agreement, I had an obligation to support the transition to ensure continuity of operations. The way he said it was confident, as if it were an obvious truth. Human Resources nodded slightly. In-house counsel still said nothing. I waited for him to finish. When he stopped, I did not offer any argument. I did not say he was mistaken. I did not reference a specific clause. I said only one sentence, evenly. Let us read the contract. There was a brief moment when no one reacted, not because they had not heard me, but because they were not used to stopping to read. The chief executive officer looked at me, as if waiting for more. I said nothing. I opened the folder in front of me, took out a printed copy of the contract, placed it on the table, and slid it gently toward the lawyer. In-house counsel glanced at the chief executive officer for a second, then nodded. He adjusted his glasses and picked up the papers. The atmosphere in the room shifted subtly, like a closed room with a window just opened. No loud sound, only the sense that something was about to unfold differently. The lawyer began to read, not skimming. Reading aloud, one section at a time. At first, everything sounded familiar. Clauses about the scope of work, term, and general obligations. The chief executive officer leaned back in his chair, hands clasped. Human resources looked down at the table. Then the lawyer paused at a section. He read more slowly. I did not need to look at the page to know which part it was. I had heard it read many times before, during late working sessions when every word had been weighed carefully. Vendor Continuity Agreement. The lawyer read the subheading, then continued with the definitions. My name appeared, clearly and unambiguously, not as a job title, but as an individual responsible for maintaining continuity in the supplier relationships listed in the appendix. The chief executive officer leaned slightly forward. Human Resources lifted her head for the first time since the meeting began. The lawyer continued, his voice steady, but no longer quick. The supply chain operating framework I had developed was licensed for annual use. Licensed, not transferred. Subject to yearly renewal. No one interrupted. No one asked a question. The lawyer read on to the termination conditions. If employment ended without renewal of the licensing agreement, the right to use the framework would end accordingly. Any obligation to support applies only within the scope of tools and processes owned by the company. I looked at the chief executive officer. The initial confidence was gone, not all at once, but gradually, like paint peeling away in small sections. Human Resources held a pen, but did not write. The lawyer paused, reread a sentence, then continued. By the time he reached the section where my name was listed explicitly in the appendix of strategic partners, the room had fully changed. This was no longer a meeting to remind someone of obligations. It had become a reading, a session where, for the first time, words signed years ago were placed under full light. The lawyer did not comment, he only read. But I noticed how he sat more upright, how he slowed down where slowing was required. I saw him flip back a few pages, cross-checking clauses. That was the moment a professional recognized that the situation was not as simple as first assumed. The chief executive officer said nothing further. He did not object. He did not argue. He only listened. Once he seemed about to speak, then stopped. Human Resources sat very straight, eyes fixed on the pages as if reading them for the first time, even though the words were not new. When the lawyer finished the final section related to obligations and usage rights, he stopped. The room fell silent. Not an uncomfortable silence, but the silence of people recalibrating their understanding. I did not speak. I did not need to. The words had done their work. I sat with my hands on the table, listening to the breathing in the room. I felt no satisfaction, only a belated clarity. The chief executive officer finally spoke, but his voice was different, lower, slower. He asked the lawyer a short question, seeking confirmation. The lawyer answered just as briefly, without emotion, simply a fact read from the page. Human Resources looked from one person to another, as if trying to piece the picture together. I did not help them. I did not need to. I had done my part years earlier when those clauses were written. The meeting ended not with a decision, but with a realization. No formal conclusion, no statement, just a clear sense that the original assumptions no longer hold. When I stood up, I gathered my copy of the contract and placed it neatly back into the folder. I did not rush. No one rushed. I looked once more at the room where decisions were usually made very quickly. That morning, everything had slowed down, exactly as the contract required it to. They had signed it years ago. Today was the first time they read it. I did not go back as before. That sentence was not spoken in the meeting room, nor was it meant to make an impression. It simply became very clear in my mind as I left the building in Soho that morning. Everything had changed, not because I wanted it to, but because the old assumptions no longer held. And when the context has shifted, there is no reason to return to a position built on things that are no longer true. The next call came sooner than I expected. Not from the chief executive officer, but from in-house counsel. His tone was noticeably more careful than when he had read the contract. He said the company wanted to continue the discussion, this time with the intent of finding a solution. I agreed. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted everything to be said clearly, once. The meeting took place in the same room, but the atmosphere was entirely different. The earlier sense of overwhelming confidence was gone, and there was no defensiveness either. Everyone sat straighter, spoke more slowly. The chief executive officer opened by acknowledging that there were aspects of the contract that had not been fully considered. Not an apology, but an acknowledgement. For me, that was enough to begin. He said the company was facing two uncomfortable options. One was to continue operating the supply chain in a state of instability with increasing risk as peak season approached. The other was to restore stability as quickly as possible. I listened without interrupting. I let him finish, because this was the first time he was not speaking from the position of someone certain he was right. When it was my turn, I did not speak at length. I did not revisit what had happened. I did not list the consequences they were facing. I simply said that I would not go back to the way it was before, not back to an undefined role, not back into a structure where everything depended on temporary goodwill. If they wanted me involved again, it had to be under a new agreement that reflected reality. Option A was placed on the table first. I would return as an independent consultant for a defined period. No longer a full-time employee, no unspoken expectations. A clear scope of work, focused on stabilizing the supply chain through peak season. My framework would be licensed under new terms, aligned with its actual value. I made it clear this was not a concession. It was the only way to ensure that all parties understood what they were doing and why. The chief executive officer asked about the cost. I answered with a number, directly. That number was significantly higher than my former salary. I did not explain or justify it. I simply said it reflected the risk, the experience, and the time required. No one objected immediately. Human resources took notes. The lawyer nodded, already calculating. Option B was addressed next, without my needing to raise it. In-house counsel outlined the financial obligations if the company chose not to continue working together and did not renew the framework license. The number was not small, not just a cost, but the consequence of losing stability in the supply chain at the most sensitive point of the year. The chief executive officer remained silent as he listened. No one interrupted. I did not present option B as a threat. I did not say what I would do if they declined option A. I simply allowed both possibilities to exist on the table. On one side, a new agreement, uncomfortable but manageable. On the other hand, a price to be paid, not only in money, but in time and credibility. There was a moment in the room when I realized they were looking at me differently, not as a former employee and not as an adversary, but as a partner they had once taken for granted. That realization brought me no satisfaction. It simply confirmed that my decision was the right one. The chief executive officer asked one final question, whether there was any way to return to how things were before, with a few minor adjustments. I answered quietly. There was no before to return to. The world had changed, and so had the way we worked. I said it without bitterness. I said it as an obvious fact. The meeting ended without an immediate decision. They needed time. I understood that. These choices were not easy, and they should not be made hastily. I stood and gathered my documents. No one stopped me. No one asked me to stay. Everything that needed to be said had been said. As I left the room, I did not feel like I had won a confrontation. I did not feel like I had closed an old chapter either. I only knew that I had drawn the boundary at the right moment. I did not go back as before, not because I could not, but because I should not. I simply chose what was right for me. I left that building feeling lighter than I expected, not because I had achieved something grand, and not because a clear victory had just been declared. The lightness came from knowing that things had finally been put in their proper place. When I stepped through the glass revolving door in Soho, the city was as loud as it always was. Traffic, voices, rushed footsteps. No one knew a meeting had just ended upstairs. And that was perfectly fine. I did not stop to celebrate. There was no reason to. I also did not turn back to look at the building again. The years I spent working there were enough that I did not need a symbolic gesture. I had said what needed to be said, set the boundaries that needed to be set, and laid out the options clearly. The rest was no longer mine to carry. Walking toward the subway station, I thought about how this story could have unfolded differently. It could have been louder. There could have been long emails, heated arguments, and sharp exchanges that forced people to take sides. But that was not how I wanted a long chapter to end. I had spent years building, not tearing down, and I did not want my departure to become a performance. I thought about the people I had worked with, the small factories, the familiar suppliers, the people whose names never appear in annual reports. They did not need to know the details of the meeting that had just taken place. They only needed to know that the relationships they had built were still being respected, that their work was not being treated as a disposable variable. The value of people at work is rarely spoken about in the right way. It is often wrapped in slogans that sound good, but when decisions are made, it becomes easy to overlook. I have no illusion that a contract or a single meeting can change an entire system, but I do believe it can slow down reckless decisions long enough for someone to read, to think, and to face what they have signed. I do not know which option the company will choose. They may return to the table. They may accept the cost and move in another direction. Whatever they decide, it no longer keeps me awake at night. I had done my part, not only in that meeting, but in the many years before it, when I chose to work with trust and clear boundaries. Some people later asked me whether I regretted anything. I thought about that question often, and the answer was always the same. I do not regret standing up for what I believe. I also do not regret doing it calmly. Justice, if that is the right word, does not always require a loud voice or dramatic gestures. Sometimes it only needs to be placed in the light and allowed to be seen. As I walked down the steps into the subway station, I paused for a moment, not to hesitate, but to take a deep breath. Life beyond that door was waiting, with new projects, new relationships, and new challenges. I carried no bitterness. I carried clarity, and for me, that was a light enough burden to move forward with. If you are listening to this story, you may be in a very different place. You might be in your kitchen, in your car, or in a quiet room on the other side of the world. This story is not only about one company or one industry, it is about the familiar feeling of having your value dismissed, and the moment you decide not to stay silent, but not to be loud either. If you have ever been in a situation like that, you know that we do not always get the chance to say everything perfectly, but we can always choose how we act. Choose to set boundaries. Choose to read carefully. Choose not to return to structures that no longer respect people. If something in this story resonated with your own experience, I invite you to stay. Subscribe to the channel if you would like to hear more stories told slowly, without judgment, without forcing sides. Stories about work, about people, and about small moments that can change the course of a long journey. There is no need to rush. Just stay if it feels right. And if you wish, share the story with someone who needs to hear that they are not alone in how they feel. Sometimes justice does not need noise. It only needs to be read correctly.